Hello? Okay. Okay, let's wait 2 more minutes until everybody's in the room and then we get started. So, good afternoon. Welcome to Bruegel, and thanks a lot for making it. I was already told it's not an easy subject at 36 degrees, so luckily it's a bit colder today. But what we would like to talk about today is fair allocation of electricity system cost. And the reason why we thought this is an important topic is there is a lot of discussion among economists normally about how to design a system in the most efficient way. So what technologies we need, what do we want to build, how do we set the right incentives for getting the right technologies. But today we want to talk about a topic that is most of interest to policymakers, which is not at all about system cost and efficiency, but which is about who in the end has to cover the cost, who has to shoulder the cost. And as I will explain you at the beginning of the presentation, this is a topic that should receive increasing attention. The way in which the event is structured today is it's a public event, so it's on the record. It will be also video streamed. We will, in the end, have time for questions, also via Slido. The hashtag is hashtag electricity. So if you already want to put up some questions on my tablet, you can do so. And what we will do now is I will give a 10 minutes presentation, maybe 12, on the report that we have done on the subject. Then I have a great panel with whom I hope to be able to discuss that and get critical feedback, but also dive a bit deeper into some of the important areas. And then at the end, there is some time for Q&A. So I will do my presentation from here because it's a bit easier. Maybe. Yes. So the paper that I would like to present is already on the website. You can download it there. Has much more kind of material than I can present now. It's joint work by Conal Heusaf, who has left Bruegel by now and is now back to Ireland. Eva Jüngling, that is here and will also say a few words. Simone Tagliapietra and myself. So why do we think it's important? Well, our take is that the share of electricity system cost in GDP in our economy is going to grow substantially because we want to essentially electrify our economy. So therefore, the share of oil and gas is going to decrease, but the share of electricity in GDP, which is maybe around 3% today, is going to increase further. So it's going to be a more and more important area of the economy. At the same time, we want to decarbonize the system, which means that we sometimes have to use more expensive technologies than just lignite that we might have used in the past, which further increases some of the cost of electricity. At the same time, the political and also the economic rationale for attributing the cost of the system, so this 3, 4, 5% of GDP, to different actors is also not the same that it used to be in the past. There are two main drivers that I would argue there are. There are changing production technologies. So we have more capital-intensive production technologies. Grids get more important, backup capacities get more important, renewables get more important, and there's less a question of kind of attributing OPEX, but it's more a question now of attributing CAPEX, which poses different questions from an economic standpoint on the right attribution of cost. And on the consumption side, by way of contrast, we essentially have much more elasticities in the past. In the past, you had essentially your installations and they were consuming electricity. Now you have heat pumps that you can switch on and off depending on the electricity price. You might buy an electric vehicle or not. So on the demand side, you have more elasticity. So that for an economist would already open up a whole PhD thesis on trying to identify what that means for the right attribution of cost. On top of that, we now want to price externalities properly. So carbon pricing has to come in. And we have the big challenge to see what the ratio between the clean fuel and the dirty fuel prices are in order to get to our decarbonization targets. And finally, because we integrate our markets across borders, we have cross-border effects that are not negligible either. Now, everybody asks how we can reduce electricity price pressure on consumers. And we lined out a couple of ideas here, and the lower bar on lowering capital cost and reducing inefficiencies is what we typically look into. So we have a couple of papers on how the internal market could help to reduce capital cost and to reduce inefficiencies in the system. But that's not what we are going to talk about today. What we are going to talk about today is how can we redistribute cost between different groups of consumers, households, industry, from ratepayers to taxpayers, so put some of the cost potentially in the general budget. Sometimes there's a question of, is it possible to shift some of the cost across borders? And then also between different actors in the energy system, so these discussions about windfall profit taxation or changing the clearing rules in the market in order to implicitly expropriate some of the incumbent electricity system actors. So we are talking about very different tools here. And I think that's important to understand. It's not just one tool set, and it's also not just one actor here, but we have taxation, which is run by the government. You can do tax reductions on VAT or windfall profit taxation. We can do fiscal support, which is also done by the government. So you can hand out public grants and loans, but also guarantees, like for contracts for difference, which have financial value to the government. A second element is then redistribution of fixed cost. As I said at the beginning, we will have much higher fixed cost in a new system. Renewable support systems are currently often paid through taxation, for example, but then the electricity is used by electricity consumers. The same might hold for capacities that is procured through capacity mechanisms that is then put on the, that has to be distributed among the different consumers. So here you have a new challenge, and also the old challenge of electricity grid tariffs. How are they how is the cost of this electricity grid that is going to maybe double in the next decades? How is that attributed to different types of consumers. And then finally, a lot of the discussions through the during the energy crisis was on changes in market design. You might recall the discussions on the Spanish exemption, for example, where we move from, where the idea was to move away from marginal pricing to something more like average pricing in the system. Economists don't like that because it's highly inefficient, but from a distributional perspective, it was politically opportune for the Spanish government at the time to go in that direction, and the discussion is still ongoing in Brussels as well. Now, the argument that I think it's my main point that I want to highlight in this presentation is distributional effects in this electricity system matter, and they are what policymakers are most interested in, and it's not a new phenomenon. As you can see here in the picture, you have very different distribution of the energy system cost between households and industry consumers in the different European countries, which indicates you there is a lot of political kind of ability to make this, to shift the cost in one direction or the other direction. So it's not a discussion that is purely academic. It's not something that policymakers hope they could do but could not do, but it's something that is very real, where policymakers have a chance to shift cost between different consumer groups, here on the example of household versus industry. Now, I would like to pass the floor to Eva to give a short insight in the analysis that we did.
Yeah, thank you. So what we aim to do here is to quantify the trade-offs of two short-term options. And the reason why we came up with our own estimates was there is no electricity market model that provided us with the numbers that we were looking for. So the two options that we looked at was the cost redistribution among different types of consumers, and also the removal of non-energy costs, so VAT. And you can also see on this graph the different system costs and what they consist of, and consumer costs and what their share of demand and their share of costs are. And so for the first option, we shifted the price increase from from energy-intensive industries towards households. So what we aimed to do here was to reduce energy-intensive industry prices back to 2019 levels, so before the energy crisis. And then we shifted that price increase towards households, and that meant a 3 percentage point increase towards households. And here it's important to note that we had to leave out certain incentive and dynamic effects in order to keep the analysis feasible. And it is also important to note that there are some competitive competition effects on the internal market arising out of this. And here you can see that the improved competitiveness for energy-intensive industry comes at a price. So here the shifting of industry electricity prices leads to household price increases between 3 and 14%. And for Germany, for example, the 9% in concrete terms would mean a price increase of around 200 euros annually. So this is important to consider when deciding on a policy option, for example, that would shift prices from industry towards household consumers. And the second option that we looked at was to remove non-energy costs, so VAT. And here we estimated a bit of an upper bound of a cost reduction, because we decided to reduce VAT to 0, which there are some EU legislation that limit the amount to this, that limit the amount that can be done. But yeah, we wanted to estimate an upper bound, so to say. And here, this showed a 21% price reduction in Poland. This again depends on the different countries and also on the different households. But overall, it is very clear that with this option, all consumers receive a price reduction. However, you can see here And this is also the current discussion going on in Germany with the coalition deciding on electricity tax reduction, that this creates a large fiscal hole. So in Germany, this was deemed the reduction of electricity prices was deemed unfeasible because of the large hole it creates, and we expect a similar effect to arise of a measure such as this one. And as you can see, for Germany, it would be 18.1 billion. And for other countries, so France, Italy, the effect would be smaller. However, it would still be substantial because the revenues from electricity VAT are so large and so important to the public finances. And yeah, these policy options basically informed our electricity pricing principles that we set out in the paper, and that will be discussed in more detail by Georg.
Okay, two more slides to wrap up. So we came up with 4 principles. So the first one is probably the most controversial one. It is that from an efficiency standpoint, it made sense to put as much of the system cost on inelastic consumption, because it means that you have, in economic terms, less deadweight loss. So you would try to identify who are those consumers or producers that would do still the same if they are getting have to pay a higher share of the system cost, and would put it on them, because that would help to keep the efficiency in the system as high as possible. The second principle is also a difficult one in terms of that economic objectives should not compromise energy goals. So it means that there is a tendency to use distributional to target distributional effects, but then have very negative efficiency effects, and that we should avoid. And then another element is, of course, that we need to maintain the pricing of negative externalities. 3 examples for what that could mean. We would like to. We would argue that we should limit household subsidies towards energy-intensive industry, because households, which were in the past highly inelastic, are now becoming elastic. We want them to switch to electric vehicles and heat pumps, and therefore we cannot put the burden on them, because their elasticity is actually what is needed to decarbonize. The second one is that we need kind of to better reflect system conditions, so better use time-varying prices than fixed charges, both for the grid usage and the generation, and then carbon pricing needs to be maintained. And then finally, again, the main point of the whole exercise, and I know it's a bit kind of abstract, is we should acknowledge the interdependence of distributional and efficiency questions in this topic of distributional effects of electricity tariffs, of taxation, of market design. So those 2 things should not be split as they are currently done, but we need to think that better together. We need much better analytical tools for that. Would be very interested to hear from you if you have seen anything, but we have not been able to identify any good analytical tool that is able to think about distributional and efficiency questions at the same time in the electricity sector, which is so important, as I try to line out. Second point is we should learn from the energy crisis. As economists, we can learn a lot, because we have seen a big shock to the system that teaches us a lot about elasticities in the system and optimal tools, but also policymakers should learn from that. And then we would argue that EU guidelines for electricity cost recovery should be established in a broad sense. They need to reflect economic principles. There's the communication from the Commission that goes into that direction, but it's not really a really binding guidelines. We need the different tools to be stored together, and we need to prevent distortions in the internal market, which the current communication of the Commission does not address in my view at all. So if some countries have very low network tariffs and other countries have very high network tariffs, this will have distortions between the countries, and that need to be thought about and properly addressed. And then the final point, kind of the ceterum censeo from our side, is if we want to really have low energy prices, the only way to get there is through a well-integrated physically and institutionally European electricity market to reduce the system cost, because we can shift the cost as much as we want. The cost only go away if we make the system more efficient. So with that, I leave my role as presenter and then turn into a moderator. And and as moderator, it's my great pleasure to welcome a really perfect panel for the subject. Let me briefly introduce you the panelists. So the first panelist is Benoit Esnault. Benoit is vice chair of the gas working group, but at the Council of the European Energy Regulators. But he is also working at CRE, the French regulator, dealing with electricity, and I hope we can learn a lot from him on network tariffication and distributional effects there. The second panelist is Anna Störk. She is member of the European Parliament for the Austrian NEOS party. She serves at the ITRE committee, and one of the reasons why we invited her is that she was the rapporteur for the electricity grids report of the European Parliament, where she also had to think about cost allocation in that context. And then, last but not least, we have Dirk Zwieder. He's vice president energy economics and policy foresight at E.ON. E.ON, as a German utility that has both looking into distribution grids, but also as a supplier has a rather broad view on the topic that is not only active in Germany but also in many other European countries. And Dirk is the main author of the E.ON Energy Playbook, where he discusses or where he and his colleagues discuss a lot where cost savings in the system could come from. So maybe I would like to start out with Anna and with already a rather sensitive question. I mean, what I try to outline is that there is a need for better harmonization, but also better kind of more comprehensive thinking about these distributional effects. And I wonder to which degree you think more European harmonization of such questions is useful and practical.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for the presentation as well. I jotted down quite a lot, and I'm always so pleased and impressed with the work that you do that helps us policymakers as well. Because as you said, I mean, you just mentioned it yourself, you're missing data, you're missing analytic tools, and that's exactly what we need as policymakers as well, is the actual data to make sure that we know what effects the decisions we're making are actually having. And particularly, and I think this is maybe just to start us off, I think especially when it comes to networks, which I've always looked at quite intensively over the last few months, we can see that we are missing a lot of data and information and transparency that can really help us, especially address what you just mentioned in the end, the question of efficiency and how we can make sure that system costs overall go down. And this is also where the European level, I guess, comes in a little bit, where we see that, unfortunately, it is quite hard to make European decisions when you don't know what is going on the ground. So even just the need to collect data and information on a European level to make sure that we have better informed decision making, particularly cross-border, is one of the main issues and questions. When it comes to the actual financing or the actual cost allocation, to what extent that should be done on a European level, I have to admit that I'm a little bit torn on that, because on the one hand, I think obviously the design, the market design, the design of network costs I think we could learn from each other as well. I mean, we see some countries having quite low costs or having been able to lower the costs. I think that is actually more interesting to see the effects over time rather than just looking at the system, because the systems are so different. But when you see a country having managed to bring down costs, such as, you know, if I look at parts of Italy, for example, that have managed that quite well, where I think, you know, obviously we have to learn from each other and we should use similar designs. And I think we can definitely benefit from more European harmonized regulations, etc. But I do want to say that particularly the question that is always kind of, always somewhat in the room, like not quite an elephant, more, I don't know, maybe a dog, but is the question of, should we have harmonized network tariffs also in terms of the amounts? And there is where I'm torn, or where my negative side comes in on the European level, because we simply have such different systems throughout Europe. And we don't even have to look throughout Europe. If I look at my own country, I mean, you can't compare the need for the grid, for example, for a city like Vienna, with a county of Carinthia. Now, you probably don't know where that is and what that is, but it is a very scarcely populated. You have, a little town over here and then 3 houses over there, and the need to connect them. And if you over-harmonize, I think then this can have negative effects that go beyond the energy system. So I think it is a bit of a yes and no answer that says, yes, I think we should have a more European framework, and we should make sure that the European options that are already there need to be implemented by all countries, which we're still not seeing, such as flexible network tariffs, the possibility for flexible, also just energy tariffs, electricity tariffs. That needs to be implemented throughout, but there still needs to be enough room for differences between the different regions, between the different countries, to make sure that we don't get rid of signals and price signals. And I think, if I can kind of end on that as well, I think this is very important to me as well when we talk about who should be charged, and also when we look at not just the question of distribution and allocation of the cost from the operators themselves, but when we look at questions of subsidies, etc., I think we just have to be very careful to make sure that the market can still work as a market and provide us with price signals, because we saw some countries like my own almost overcompensating, and then the price signals aren't there anymore, and then we lack efficiency and we lack the push and need for companies to use flexibility, as you said, for the households to be interested in having more flexibility and demand flexibility as well. So that, I think, is a very important aspect we can't overlook.
Can I maybe ask one follow-up question on that? I mean, on the network tariffication is probably one of the more complex parts of the story that we discuss anyway. But there is no discussion on having generation components being included again, because there's cross-border distributional effects that need to be considered. There is a question to which degree some member states might want to subsidize specific groups of consumers by giving them very, very low network tariffs, which then influence the internal market as well. And so how far should the Commission try to push some principles? Can we think maybe of some more general principles that then in the end need to be interpreted by DG Comp or somebody, in order to make sure that we don't have to harmonize everything, we don't have to very narrowly regulate all the details, but we still make sure that the system runs efficiently? So would you see any solution to this simplicity versus kind of complex questions?
It's a very hard question to answer, because, as you said, I mean, it is such a complex question and problem we're faced with, and unfortunately, as per usual, it's not one or the other. I think it's somewhere in the middle, because, I mean, we're now seeing the Commission making it easier for nation states to give subsidies or state aids to the industry, for example, when it comes to energy prices. And on the one hand, this is very understandable, and I can see why, again, specifically with an Austrian hat, where we do suffer under quite high energy prices compared also to other parts of Europe. However, at the same time, we can't let that lead also to a too much of a not competition, but within changes within or differences. That's the word I was looking for. Differences within Europe, because then again we're going to have a problem if we have too much variation between our different member states, and we know that we have different opportunities also budget-wise. So I think the Commission should be quite strict in making sure, and actually the proposal at the moment I think is strict enough with a limit, and it can't go, the energy prices can't go below through subsidies, through state aid. I think that is important because we have to make sure that we remain somewhat comparable and that we remain in a fair competition amongst each other, because we're already trying to compete with outside of the EU, so we should focus on that and not compete too much with each other.
Yeah, no, it is going to be continue to be a very challenging question. I mean, one argument would be if you kind of allow everybody to take 5 cents and everybody takes all the time 5 cents, then it's also not efficient because you have all these time dimensions. But I very much understand where the Commission is coming from, and so maybe following up directly on that, Benoit. So you are both active in Brussels with CER and in Paris with Creux. On the question of network tariffication, do you think there is some more need for European rules in order to prevent inefficient distortions that we talked about, and how could that look like in your view?
Well, thank you for inviting the regulators first, and thank you for your paper. I must underline that you raised most of the important topics, and especially regarding the cost structures we're moving towards, and especially this increase in terms of CapExes versus the OpExes, and the fact that we are now more in a capacity system. And clearly that changes a lot of things in terms of our, let's say, classical way of thinking. As regulators, I would say our task first is to work for consumers, and I would say that the questions you ask is, what does it mean to work for consumers? Because we see the different categories. I would say an angle is, of course, affordability for the final consumers, also for households. So in this debate, there is still a topic about, let's say, energy poverty, and the fact that, well, households need to heat and have access to energy. So the issue is slightly different than the one of industry competitiveness. But when we look at the trade-offs around the EU, and I think it's some of the elements we can get from the pictures and the analysis you carried out, is we have very different situations, which can also be explained by the different structures of the economies. You have countries where you have a lot of industry, others where you have less, and probably the way decisions have been made to let's say, split costs among the different stakeholders have been different, probably for good reasons. Sometimes, not necessarily always for good reasons, but there is, in general, a rationale behind. So it's important. I think I like your point about the differences of situations amongst member states, because it's really what we're dealing with. And if I give a few words about my experience as a regulator contributing to the European debate, it's that we need to acknowledge the fact that we have big countries, we have small ones. The reflection there is nowadays, for example, on the regional planning of infrastructure cannot be addressed the same way if you have a series of small territories or in large territories as France, Germany, for example, but also Spain or Italy. You see, so we need to have a European system which is smart enough to provide some clear guidelines, a clear vision, and then allowing the member states to go ahead with the implementation. And in this respect, I would say that the position of regulators somewhere is bridging concepts and decision. And we are really involved first in the overall reflection, what would make sense in terms of economic analysis, in terms of integration, of creating the single market, and at the same time, when we get to stakeholders, operators, designing tariffs, what can we do? And I would say that from this experience, we are living in a world where there are two key elements. The first one is uncertainty, and the second one is complexity. And when making decisions, we need to address these two aspects from the beginning. And somewhere that could contradict some kinds of visions of, let's say, central planning, so to have an optimized vision of the dynamics of the energy system as a whole by 2050 and so on. To me, we need more humility and say, okay, let's start from this statement of complexity. The fact that, for example, if we get now to the cost of the system, I would say first, the costs to be recovered are first the cost of the existing system. So nowadays, tariffs are covering these current costs. How much margin do we have here to reduce the burden and so on? I think here it's quite limited. So the very question is about the future. And the future, then we get into making good decisions. And that's very challenging because we have these developments around scenarios. There are a lot of debates on scenarios. And then from these scenarios, how can we have a representation of the system? And from this representation, what are the kinds of conclusions we can get in order to agree upon an investment? I would talk about my daily job here, because agreeing means that we cannot only rely on scenarios, we need to have more elements, because in the end, we are committing some spendings, sometimes of billions of euros, and then to be repaid either by tariffs, which is our angle, actually. Yeah, the doctrine amongst the regulators is to have, let's say, a cost-plus regime, plus incentives. It's more or less the way it works, because there is a right to operators to get back their costs. And the other angle, of course, is about taxes, subsidies. So, and I will conclude this before getting to other questions. To me, this very challenge today is, from the picture we have, the ambitions and all the parameters that we need to work with, is to find some ways in order to make good decisions, meaning that we prioritize the investment which are absolutely needed, I would say, in the short term or the midterm, and progressively we build the new system. But not necessarily having already a view to the final target, but using a target, let's say, as determining a track in order to allow making decisions. That would be my contribution to this debate at this stage.
Allow me, please, to follow up a bit on the role of the regulator in that, if I may. So the first one would be, we talked about the increasing role of capex, and kind of capacity mechanisms is something that France already has and is popping up in other countries as well now. Would you see in principle a higher role for regulators in the future of taking distributional decisions, or will that somehow be transferred back to this role to the ministries?
Well, on this institutional question, as a regulator, I mean, our legitimacy to say we should be the one carrying out the activity is quite limited. Honestly, we are public administrations, and we are carrying out the activities which have been decided by the legislator. So I would stand there. In terms of taxes, for example, I wouldn't say that we are very legitimate to say whether we should have more taxes, less subsidies, and so on. We generally defend some principles of economic efficiency. So I would say here, we are more there to propose the expertise we've been building over the past 25 years. And here, actually, we developed a lot of skills in terms of tariff making, calculations, and acting as, let's say, a public authority, but in connection with industry. I would say this is the added value, and probably this added value, well, these characteristics can serve making decisions. But I would let it to the legislator, actually.
So did I understand correctly? The regulator essentially fulfills the mandate that the government gives them. The rules are relatively clear, so it's mainly execution. Or is there a role of the regulator to some, by setting its own implementation that has distributional effects, and might that role increase in the future?
It's not only acting on the topics that we were asked to. We have some kind of creativity, because when we're developing tariff structures, these questions of incentives and having the relevant stakeholders paying the right price, it is in the hands of regulators because of this expertise. Let me just give the example of gas. because somewhere the gas sector can also give some interesting elements to the electricity sector. We have a regime in general where, we need a lot of flexibility within the gas system. So we need to have overcapacities. And we have ways of splitting costs in our methodologies in order to have consumers requiring the highest peak of, the peak supply to contribute more to capexes than the, let's say, flat consumers. So we have ways here to address these different uses of the system and to determine what are the costs incurred. But if we go one step further, should we help a sector versus another and so on, here it goes a little bit beyond our intervention, I would say.
Okay, and then last question, with asking for a very short answer. Anna mentioned, and also we in our presentation mentioned, that it's quite hard to find good analysis on the distributional effects of some of those decisions. Do regulators carry such analysis out because they have more detailed data on that, or?
Well, actually, we could. I wouldn't say, we may do so. We have the consumer group within the CR, which is carrying out detailed analysis on the pricing mechanisms. There's been some work about the support tariffs and subsidies to consumers during the crisis. So actually, I would say in terms of transparency, the regulators produce a lot of data, and I would say that we have quite a good level of transparency. The thing is, when you have a lot of data, how to deal with them. That's why we need to have some research centers to get all these data and make something of it. It's part of the role of regulators. We have some departments dealing with retail prices and so on. It's the task of regulators. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Then they're coming to you, and maybe with also a kickoff question, but then you feel free also to add to what you have heard. My sense, also as you've seen in the presentation, is that there's very different instruments that have distributional effects in the electricity system. And would your feeling be that there should be some drive towards more consistency between energy taxation, market design, network tariffication, in order to find the best balance between an efficient and a fair system? Or should we give each of the actors in the system, so the policymakers, the regulators, at the European level, just their leeway, hoping that in the end the system plugs together in an efficient way?
Is that a yes or no question, really? I think I would say give it a bit of both. There were also some thoughts I had when you asked this question about should the EU play a bigger role in cost distribution? Because as you rightfully said, there's a quite national element in here. And my feeling is that at least in some aspects, we do have from Europe a frame, but we may not always use it. So one example, in Germany, we right now have a big discussion about reducing the taxes on electricity for households. And effectively, the new government said in their coalition agreement that they would reduce it. Now they see, that costs a lot of money. So it looks like they're not doing it. But it's generally allowed by the European frameworks to do it. So I think we need to get this kind of freedom with the view on how it can make things, electricity or the whole energy system, more pricier, so less cost intensive, but not give us all the rules. So what I want to say with that is I think it's not a European issue, it's a national issue. The European, and yes, there are some regulatory aspects for fair allocation, would like to come to that as well. That links to this yes and no a bit. But what I do share is your study comes at a very important time, because I do have the feeling that this allocation and fair allocation of cost has not yet been adequately covered and is absolutely unsolved, fully unsolved, and it will increase over time. Why that? I mean, we all have the feeling that electricity really, and the power system as a whole, really transform how we look at energy. So it will be electricity will be the fueling station of the future. It will provide us with the heat that we need to a large extent. So we will see a massive electrification. And the costs that we pay for this system will double over time. And we're not talking about small numbers here. On average, between 2019 and 2021, the costs were 280 billion per year. So if that doubles over time, this is an enormous cost. So what we need to do first, and where also then the Commission can help, is to make sure that we reduce as much as possible the costs that we need to get towards net zero. And this is a big chunk. And the other thing there are a couple of elements that you could do, and you mentioned our study, so there's a lot in it that we think. So prioritization, electricity certainly is one element of it, but it also means to, we say, scale the system. So do we really have the customer demand for the hydrogen that we currently plan for? We don't see it. We see a delay of 7 years. And we need to make that very clear again. It's not only then about saving a lot of money in this infrastructure build-up. We also save then money that we would invest into the renewables that we just need to produce green hydrogen. We would also save the money that we need to connect the renewables that were designated for that, but also the electrolyzers to the system. So there's a massive reduction here, and that alone can save us 200 billion over the next, over the decades. So it really is a sizable amount of money that we're talking about. If we just make sure that we scale the system according to the needs and the reality, which makes it a bit harder, because usually, or some people would like to plan it for the future, right? We would like to make a plan now and be very precise on what we need over the next couple of years. We think this will lead to a system that is really expensive. And why do we care about this? And this then comes to cost allocation. We looked at this for German customers, and a middle-class household that is not able to transition. So someone who lives in a flat, a tenant. With the current cost distribution systems, will face over the next year, so until 2030, extra cost of nearly 300 euros per year. And that comes from this change of the system and also, of course, increasing grid costs. And that considers the current system. So we redistribute exempt industries a lot from grid costs, and then this is transferred to the households. And these people, they do not have the means to use the advantages of the transition. What happens with those who have these? And we need to remember who that is. This can be a middle-class family, but they own an own house. They can put a PV on their roof, put a battery in their garage, and also have a charger for the e-vehicle. They can save nearly 400 euros per year. So although those are average numbers, this is going to increase. So we will have a massive distribution problem in the future because these costs increase, as I outlined, and thus we're coming back then to this allocation problem, because do we think it is a solution to transfer the money now from industry to the households or vice versa? And this is really difficult, right? So either then it's just the households or it's the others. But we need to think about this, and I can't say if that is now a European issue to solve or is a national issue to solve. It's an issue to solve. And it is on us as well to think about the methods that can be applied. So what could it be? Of course, we can talk about reducing electricity taxes to the bare minimum in order to just enable electrification, because that is part of the solution that we all see, but it will not solve all. We can think about maybe a fairer distribution of grid costs by changing the system towards a capacity-based system, because we know that this in future will be a capacity-based system. So why don't we also think about that? But it has challenges, because some people which are exempt now, and those are those households that I mentioned that are able to use the transition for their advantage, so with the PV on the roof and the EV. How do we deal with that? I mean, if we change that system and they are no longer exempt, then we have all those issues in there. But I think these are the difficult questions we need to tackle, and where Bruegel and others, I think, started to look at, but need to do a lot more, because those are very also, I think, politically highly relevant questions, and that's why we also look at it. I mean, as a highly regulated grid company, you could assume, hey, we get the money back anyway. But no, if the society is not willing to pay for this transition, and we have populist tendencies and see that in many countries today, then we think we have a societal issue as well that we need to attack. So that's why I think it's very important that you look into this.
Many things. I would like to pick up one of the points, because I think you gave a perfect example of the switch from kilowatt hours to kilowatts as something that is reflecting the new world, but is politically difficult. And for political difficult questions, I would like to come to you. Have you encountered this in the discussions on the Grid On initiative that you had, and kind of what have been the arguments? Do you see opportunity to move towards more capacity-based grid tariffication, or is that going to be politically suicidal?
If I may just one word, because that's also obviously very political, about you were just mentioning kind of populist tendencies to also fight the energy transition. Now, there's not really any worth in looking in the past, I know that, but I do want to say that, in a way, the communication from parties and people like me who are very pro-energy transition, we made it very easy for those populists, because we tried to argue for the energy transition by telling everyone everything's going to be cheaper. And now we're telling them, well, the transition just costs. So we shoveled our own grave to a certain extent when it comes to that. And I think that's why also it's so important that we're now being very honest and frank about the fact that that transition does cost and why it costs that. And I think that is also one aspect where the transparency, we just talked about transparency of data for policymakers, for intellectuals, for academics, but there's also a need of transparency towards the consumers. I mean, and I'm also speaking not as a politician, but as a citizen, and as someone representing citizens. I could not tell you from my electricity bill what part of that is now the VAT, what part of that are some other levies that might have nothing to do with the actual energy I use or consume, how much of that is a network tariff, how much of that is the actual energy. And I would even less be able to tell you how I could change that by changing supplier, etc. So there's a need also, and for me, that is also a democratization of the system to give more of an opportunity and possibility. And I want to stick with that word democratization, or solidarization also in a way. I mean, we have a system that is based on solidarity, right? A system that means everyone who uses it should be paying. And as you said, I mean, we see a complete change in the system, right? I mean, this isn't a transition, this is a revolution. And when we look at, for example, the distribution grid, I mean, it has a completely new role today than it had even 5 to 10 years ago. I had a very nice example from the Viennese DSO who told us just a few years ago they had 4 suppliers or 4 producers adding their energy into their system. Now they have over 300,000 through solar PVs, home PVs, etc. So the role has changed completely. So if we look at those numbers, how could we expect the payment system to remain the same? So of course we had those discussions to see who needs to be charged for network costs with those network tariffs. Can it only be consumers? Can it be based on the kilowatt hours that I actually take out of the system? And I think, again, if we look at the change of the system, the answer will have to be no, at least in the future. And this is not just households that have PVs. I mean, I, being a member of the industry committee as well, I get to visit quite a lot of industries. I get to see what they invest in. Well, what they invest in is having their own energy supply, putting PVs up, some even putting their own wind turbines up to be able to support themselves, to supply themselves. But this is taking potential money out of the network tariffs. So, this, and then we have energy communities, which are incredible. We need them for the energy transition, but they're a problem when they then take themselves out of that solidarity or of that system. So I think, yes, absolutely, there will have to be changes. But all these changes, for me, it's always, we have to, and you as a regulator, I mean, you have those conversations daily of people having to show you why they need the money. And this, I think, is important. Yes, we can talk about how we can get different people and more people to pay part of it. But I think especially because you focus so much now of the increase in capex, I do want to mention that I think we also have to make sure that there are very clear rules, and I think those have to be European to make sure that they are applied everywhere, that there are very clear rules for DSOs, for TSOs to prove why those capex costs are actually needed, why the hardware, a build out of hardware wires is actually needed, and why we can't use efficiency, why we can't use flexibility instead, why we can't use digitalization, modernization first before we need that. But then that's why we also have to make sure that in this conversation we talk about OPEX as well, because they might rise as well. And we need to make sure that there's a balance here as well, that we have the most efficient system and not just a build out, because that is what brings the money in.
I like your point a lot, that we, especially on the non-market elements of the system, we need more transparency and accountability to be sure to see what is going on. And we currently would not have that. We have not been able to find any good data on what different DSOs are actually kind of collecting in terms of money and what their investment plans are. Would be very interesting to scrutinize that more. I would now switch towards the Q&A session. There is questions in the room. I will start out with one question from Slido. There the hashtag is electricity, and it's a question to Benoit. The question here by Anonymous is that the Commission published yesterday, Commission communication yesterday published, acknowledges the possible role of public budgets to support decarbonization and limit tariff increases for consumers. So do you think it's a good idea that the public budget comes into lowering tariff cost? And maybe adding to this question, does that change anything about the way those networks need to be regulated?
That's no. That's I more or less answered already, saying that, as let's say, more technical bodies, the regulators here are not fully legitimate to say this. I would say there are different angles. On the one hand, if we listen to some economists, I mean, prices are the first incentive for a good use of energy. In that sense, we could say there is here distortion of the price signal, and that could be seen as a negative point. At the same time, we had this example of German households I mean, here we know that a lot of people are locked into certain consumption levels for their basic needs. And here it can happen that the energy cost could be beyond what is seen as acceptable. So as it was said, here there is no easy answer. There is this point about populism and so on, you know, the political dynamics. And I heard, I was recently at the at the conference of the International Association for Energy Economists, and there was a Canadian researcher explaining, economist, not to be benevolent, let's say, well, dictators somewhere, to say, well, we need to have a view to the implementability of measures and to find a balance in order to be well, energy transition successful. So I don't directly answer the question, but I think there are different answers possible, actually.
Okay. Then I see a question from Nico. And
Hi, Nicholas Kohlmeier from Euractiv. Benoit, I was very struck by something you said quite early, that your lack of authority. My understanding was that the 2021 ECJ judgment gave regulators in the EU greater autonomy in determining grid fees. Is this not exactly the sort of interpretation of case law that empowers you to think about these questions like the Germans are doing?
okay, then let me take two more questions here in the room. Yeah. Please introduce yourself also.
Thanks a lot. I'm Stefano Spinacci from the European Parliamentary Research Service. My two questions, maybe they are a bit naive, but I try. First question is that do you think it's feasible to have a pricing adapted and targeted according to the use of the electricity? And this I speak mainly about citizens. To me, it doesn't make sense that someone who is video gaming, he pays the same price for the electricity that someone who uses electricity for a medical apparatus that he has to use all along the day because he has a rare kind of disease. So why there is not a different pricing? And then the second question is, it's feasible technically to have a dynamic pricing which change accordingly also to the charge of the network, of the grid, and is visible to the consumer, and the consumer can adapt. He knows, okay, now it's going to be more costly because different reason. I wait to use some electromenager or whatever. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And then one more.
Jędrzej Maśnicki from PGE, it's a Polish energy utility. Speaking about the system cost, we need to look at what is needed. And according to the European Resource Adequacy Assessment, we need 50 gigawatts of dispatchable fossil fuel-based fleet to ensure our security of supply. So it is moving us to the capacity mode. So speaking about the system cost allocation, do you think it is a good solution to somehow socialize that part of the cost which is connected with capacity mechanisms, for example, at the EU level, to ensure that we have energy security? Thank you.
Okay, I suggest the following, that Benoit takes the first question.
Yeah, to the
Derek,
first
the second.
question, I would say that to be clear on regulators' role, actually. So I think that we carry on this role of making sure that operators make good decisions, and clearly the objective is to control that we have efficient operators. That's the basics of our tasks. So when we determine the tariff trajectories and all these elements leading to them transferring to consumers, let's say, the cost of assets, it's our task. So I would say, yes, providing more power to regulators and allowing to have a deeper role in tariffication. Indeed, it was a way to get towards more efficiency. So, but to say, yeah, our task is really to have this dialogue with the operators, to check their decisions, and to see whether we approve or not the investment programs. You mentioned a little bit the distribution side. Well, distribution is sometimes quite complex. In France, we have one dominant DSO, so which can make it easier to identify the investment trajectories and have a constructive dialogue. Where you have hundreds of DSOs, of course, well, it's a little bit more complex.
Okay, move to the hundreds of DSOs. The question on the differentiation across consumer groups and over time.
Yeah, I think actually the last two questions to me are a bit linked. Because the last one I understood was about capacity markets. Do we need them? How much do we need? So, and the second one was more about how do we incentivize flexibility in the system, and what does that mean for the different customer groups? At least that's how I understood it. And I think they are indeed linked, because although I don't want to judge on the capacity you mentioned for the capacity market, or for backup capacities. I already gave a bit of my answer. So we do see a need for a capacity market on that. The cost shall be fairly, whatever that means, distributed to those who need it, and those are all customers in the system that are somehow connected to the grid. So again, speaks for something more capacity-based than energy-based. So my answer would be yes, you need it, and you need to distribute, socialize those costs in a way. But how much you need depends a lot on what we do about flexibility. And if we do really incentivize flexibility, we in Europe need a lot less. So we're talking about 100 to 200 gigawatts less in backup capacity that we need when we enable the flexible use. And this comes with dynamic tariffs. This comes with offering customers new solutions in order to use the flexibility of their assets, which currently is not given. I don't know how many of you have a PV and a battery, but I don't have it, but what I am told is that most of them, even the most sophisticated one, are more or less full at this point in time on the day, maybe already a bit earlier, so the batteries I'm talking about. And then the PV just dumps the electricity in the system at times where it's absolutely not needed, because then often during midday and the hours below around that, the prices are really low and give another signal. So just making this more intelligent is important. Is that something that each and every customer need to do? No, this need to be in the background. This need to be automatic. This is where digital solutions come in play, and which we are, as any company in that business, is developing and will be there in the future, and that's a huge potential. And for this, yes, these tariffs are necessary, and adequate incentivations to provide that flexibility from those sources where it's easily available. It does not mean that now each and every industry that runs baseload needs to provide flexibility. Of course not. That will not be feasible. But we do have a lot of flexibility sources in the future system that we need to make available.
And then maybe I would put also on you the question on the capacity mechanisms. Again, I don't know whether you have a take on that, but it was quite clear from a colleague that this is going to be a very big chunk of the system cost in the future, and whether there's already some discussion on how it should be fairly allocated.
I'm sure there is, but I will be completely frank and honest that I haven't been part of them, and I don't feel comfortable to give an opinion on something I'm not informed enough about. So if you allow me, I will duck that one and instead just give one brief comment about, I mean, you already answered about the flexibility, and I couldn't agree more. Just to say, on the one hand, we have good examples there as well. I mean, Denmark, they started with flexible network tariffs. They managed to, just in 4 years, I mean, obviously it's not flat yet, but flatten the use of electricity throughout the day quite massively, even just with that pretty simple solution. So we have examples that it works. We just need to do it. And then just to go into, I mean, you just mentioned the flexibility, and you said as well to give the consumer that kind of signal, and I agree, but we also have to be very aware that not every consumer is proactive enough or can be proactive enough to do it themselves. So what we also have to make sure is that we make room in our regulation, in our legislation for modern digital solutions. We again have examples there more in the US and the UK, less so in the EU when it comes to flexibility markets, question of aggregators, as you say, doing it in the background so that consumers don't even need to do much, but participate in the flexibility market anyways, and therefore provide us with more opportunities for the networks. I'll leave it at that because I think then we have more questions, and I'll try to not say too much.
Maybe just one additional point towards the regulators, because I think making, you mentioned it, that we also then need into OPEX, right? So into, traditionally a grid company has a high incentive to put copper into the ground, and this need to change. And I think this is a regulatory topic. Of course, we need to make sure that it then not putting copper in the ground is not always the solution, but we need to be able to use the flexibility. And I know it's difficult because sometimes it's an unbundling question that you need to tackle, but I think it is an important part to look deeper into, because I think we all need to work on finding these solutions.
Okay, I would like to close by going to the highest voted question, which is the classic question that comes up in these discussions, which is on the merit order pricing in the wholesale market. I mean, Connell, that is also in the discussion here, and I have done a paper on this, and many others have. The answer is the depiction that on the wholesale market, the electricity has a price of the last unit makes perfect sense, because every consumer that consumes at that moment increases the need for gas to be burned in the system, and therefore incurs this cost to the system. So it makes a lot of sense economically to have that. And what is most important is you don't buy electricity at the wholesale market. None of you. You buy electricity at a supplier like E.ON or somebody else. They are in competition with each other, and they have a portfolio of power plants that they own or that they have committed that they have contracts with very different cost structures. And all of that, they build a portfolio, they average that, they are in competition with each other, and then the price that comes out of that is a reflection of the capital and operations cost. There is not anybody making kind of huge windfall profits out of the system that you can just take away by changing the pricing system. That would be my kind of plaidoyer to really try to look again in the literature. There is no easy win from changing the pricing structure where you would create miraculously a lot of money in the system, as unfortunate as it sounds. So I thank you all for participating on this still hot day on such a rather complex topic. I learned a lot. I think also in the discussion it helped me to understand much better what the crunch points are also in an institutional setting. I like to thank the panelists for making time to come here, and you all for being here. Thanks a lot, and see you hopefully soon.